Good morning, Mr. Patrick. My name is Rachael Iwelunmor. I'm a member of the management team for the Benito Blood Bank Management System. During the course of this system, I was in charge of filling two documents, the risk assessment tool and the risk management tool. This is the risk management tool, and this management tool has 5 sheets. The first sheet is the possible risk sheet, and it is used for identifying the risk that come up during the course of the system. This sheet is divided into 3 columns: the possible risk column, the designation column, and the action column. The possible risk column contains a list of the possible risks that will come up during the course of the system, and this risk are identified during interviews based and brainstorming and talking to the clients. Then the designation, these are the letters assigned to each risk to know what we're treating it as. We can either designate a risk with the letter R to treat it as a risk, or the letter X to treat it as an issue, a concern, or a problem. Then the action column, this is where we'll define the appropriate action which we'll take for the designations. If it is X, we'll treat it as out of scope, and if it is R, we'll treat it as a risk. So for the possible risk, I have divided the risk into 3 main risks: the operational risks, the development risk, and the budget risk. The operational risk, this will happen during the use of the system after it has been deployed to the client. For example, the client could either set a weak password, and this will be treated as a risk because it will leave our system vulnerable to hackers. So we treat this as a risk and provide medium for the clients to take precaution against this risk. Now, this malware risk, this occurs when the client's system, where our system will be running on, is attacked by a malware or a virus. We really can't prevent this, but would teach the client on how to avoid this risk, such as by updating their antiviruses and stuff like that. That will be left to our management team. Then the development risk, this risk occurs during the process of developing the system. We have risks such as poor testing to detect anomalies. If the operational team do not test the system during the course of the development, there could be poor performance or malfunction in the system, which we will not detect until it gets to the deployment stage, and we'll treat this as a risk in order to avoid such anomalies. Then we also have the loss of data in this development risk. This could occur as backup failure, and this is designated with the letter R to be treated as a risk, and almost all the development risks are treated as risk because they are from our side and we can prevent them from happening. Then the budget risk, this happens due to poor accounting. For example, we have the wrong budget estimation. This is designated with the letter R and will be treated as a risk so that we'll have enough funds to continue with the system. We also have the project scope expansion. This happens where the client wants to add extra features for which our budget cannot carry, and this will be treated as a risk, although it does not have a high priority or a high risk of happening, but we still treat it as a risk because it could happen. Then we have the next sheet, the risk identification sheet. This risk identification sheet is used to analyze and prioritize the risk. We have about 5 columns in this in this sheet. We have the possible risk column, the identification number column. The possible risk, these are the risks that were designated with the letter R from the previous sheet. Then we assign each an identification number so that we can uniquely identify each risk. Then each risk is classified into categories, and that's be listed in this column. The condition, this is the cause of the risk, and the consequence, this is what will happen as a result of this risk. Now, as you can see here, we have all the possible risks that we identified in the previous sheets, and we also assigned each an identification number, and we classified them into people risk. For example, this weak password is a people risk. It happens at the end user side, and the condition is caused by setting of weak passwords by the client, and the result of this risk is that the system can be bypassed by hackers. We also have lack of generic conventions. If our functional team do not have group meetings to discuss and agree on generic conventions such as naming conventions and other conventions that can ensure the smooth running of the programming, there will be a problem, and this can be assigned in the process classification and the decision making classification. And the cause of this risk is lack of team spirit, and the consequence of this risk is merging problems. The risk is detected when it's time to merge their different codes, and it won't work because they have different naming conventions. This is the risk analysis and prioritization sheet. This is used for planning for each risk. Each risk has already been given a unique ID number. So here we set the priority, the probability, this is the likelihood of each risk occurring, the impact, this is the effect of the risk, the exposure, this field is calculated by multiplying the probability and the impact, the exposure recipients, this is who will be affected by this risk. So let's take an example, the weak passwords which have been identified by the number 1. This will be given a priority of medium because it happens, but it happens at the user side. There is really not much you can do to determine what the user sets as his or her password. So the probability of this happening is very high. That's why it was assigned a percentage of 72. So the impact of this risk was given a numeric value of 5, which falls in the category of medium. And the exposure was calculated by multiplying 72% by 5, which gave us 3.6. And this exposure, this is a numeric value to simplify the amount of the impact that it will have on the system, because it will leave our system vulnerable to hackers, and the person that will be affected by this risk is the client. Let's take another example. This is 8. This was used to identify the poor encryption of data. The priority is high because if our data is not encrypted, we would have a lot of hackers bypassing our system, and our system will not be secure for use anymore. And this was given a likelihood of 80, because if our functional team does not provide strong encryption for our data, our system will be left vulnerable to hackers. So this is a very high probability risk. This was also given an impact of 8 because it is a very high impact risk, and the exposure was also calculated by multiplying this and this, and the exposure recipient is the team, the functional team, because they will be affected by this risk. Then we have the risk planning sheet. This is used for costing and estimating how much we would need to plan for each risk. The identification number and priority are redundant from the previous sheet, so we just copied that in here. And then the mitigation plan, this is used to identify what will be done to reduce the probability of this risk happening. For example, we have this number 1, the weak password risk. This can be reduced by ensuring strong validations on our front end to ensure that the client enters a very strong password. The contingency plan is what must be done to reduce the impact of this risk, and this can be reduced by the client setting strong passwords. The trigger, this is the criteria for determining when to initiate the contingency plan, and the trigger for this is during registration. During the registration and adding of any user into the system, we should trigger this set strong password so that each user in the system will have strong password. And the person responsible for this is Abraham from the functional team. Then the deliverables, this is the deliverable that will be created by each risk plan, and this is the registration page because that is where the user is going to be registering. The activities and task, this is used to identify the task associated with each deliverable, and programming is the task associated with the registration page. And the dependencies, this depends on testing, and the time frame is 3 days. Then we also have the resource requirement. The resource that will be used for this is the functional team. Then the due date is May 28th. Risk costing. Risk costing is the last sheet. This is used to assign actual amounts to each task and each risk. This was properly done by the management team. Each risk was assigned a priority from the previous sheet, was also given a resource requirement, a resource unit cost. The resource requirement is a numeric value to identify the skills, person or hours, equipment and facilities, other hardware and software requirements for this risk. The resource unit cost, this is the estimated price for each individual resource requirement. The resource total cost, this is calculated for each risk requirement as well. All these are just prices attached to each risk, and this was done by proper planning and group meetings and interviews, because we also had to identify proposed prices for each of the functional team members and every other person working on the system. This is it for the risk management tool. Now we enter the risk assessment tool. All the fields from this risk assessment tools, they are based on what we identified in the risk management tool. So we identified the condition before, we identified the consequences, we already identified the probability, the impact, the exposure, the mitigation and every other person. So this is basically a simplified version of the risk management tool. So here we just identified all the conditions, the consequences of each risk, the probability of each risk happening, the impact of each risk, and the exposure, which is calculated by multiplying these two fields, and the mitigation, this is the trigger for each risk management, and the contingency plan is what we would do in case of the risk happening. The trigger is what will trigger the risk, and the assignee is who we assigned to handle each risk. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.